Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Paideia Institute online lecture series. This is the third lecture in our new series on translation from the classics to the contemporary. And today I'm very excited to welcome Damion Searls, who will be talking about his recent book, The Philosophy of Translation from Yale University Press. Damion Searls has translated 60 books from German, Norwegian, French, and Dutch, including modern classics by Proust, Gide, and Nietzsche, Mann, Wittgenstein, and Rilke, Patrick Modiano, Victoria Kielland, and Ariane Koch, and the fiction of 2023 Nobel Prize winner Jon Fosse. A Guggenheim, Cullman Center, and two-time NEA Fellow, he edited Thoreau's The Journal for NYRB Classics, and is the author of the Inkblots, A History of the Rorschach Test, and biography of its creator. His latest books are The Philosophy of Translation, the subject of today's talk, and The Mariner's Mirror, a poetry chapbook. Thank you so much.
Hello, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me for this excellent looking series. And I don't know how many of you out there saw something that our host wrote a few days ago, which was an excellent discussion of my book that means that I don't really need to say anything else, but I will. Yes, I will mostly be talking about this new book, The Philosophy of Translation. And the book is both a philosophy book, but also one of kind of a wave of books by practicing translators that have been coming out recently, since that is what I am. But I do have a philosophy background. So what the book tries to be is less of like my personal story about translation and more of actually an argument about what translation is, using a wealth of examples that are mostly from my own work, not because I make the world's best translation decisions, but because I know what they are. So I have a lot of experience to draw on in making my argument about what translation is. So what I mostly talk about in the book actually is reading. I think everyone would have to agree that when you're translating something, you're reading one thing and you're writing another thing. For example, you're reading a text in Greek and you're writing a text in English. So everyone can start there, no matter what your ideas of translation are, I have a feeling. But I think the reading part is the part that's most interesting and most relevant, actually, to how translation works, you might say. I talk about reading in kind of two ways. One is just reading in general, but the other is I say that reading like a translator is a sort of different kind of reading, paying attention to a sort of different kind of thing. We can maybe get to that at the end or in the Q&A if you're interested, but today, I think I'm mostly just going to talk about reading, because even just talking about reading in the normal sense before getting into translation specifics, if you really unpack what reading is, you get to a lot of what translation is. And so you don't even have to get into the specifics of how is a translator maybe reading differently from if you're just reading a book. Reading is super powerful and interesting. Reading is great. I love reading. And that, if we really think about it, really gets to most of what I have to say about the philosophy of translation. So why do I say that the translator is reading the original text and I don't say they're interpreting it or analyzing it or anything like that? I think reading sort of evokes a different sense of the relationship, and one that's closer to what I think is going on. And also, I like the level of authority implied by reading. If we talk about interpreting a book, you're kind of implicitly saying, my interpretation's better than yours. For whatever reason, I have more expertise or I'm better at it. Like, my interpretation has some priority over other stated or unstated bad interpretations. And reading, on the other hand, doesn't have that. And I don't want to have that. So that's why I talk about reading a text. Um, one of the real light bulbs that went on for me in making this argument was um, when is that people often ask, like, how do you decide how to translate this word? Like, how do you decide what word to use in English? How do you choose? And the question always felt weird because that didn't seem like what I was doing. And the analogy that I came up with is that that's like asking someone, how do you decide what Oliver Twist looks like? How do you choose what Mr. Darcy looks like when you're reading Pride and Prejudice? And of course, you don't choose. The book tells you, right? You're reading the book and it's telling you what Mr. Darcy is looking like. Now, if I'm reading it and the book is telling me what Mr. Darcy looks like, and you're reading it and the book is telling you what Mr. Darcy looks like, then our Mr. Darcys might not match. But that's not a flaw. That's not a problem. It doesn't mean that either of us is reading badly. It doesn't mean that Jane Austen should have tried a little harder and been more specific. It just means that I'm in a reading relationship with the book, and so are you, and that's how it works. And that it's still not driven by us, by me personally. I'm not choosing what Mr. Darcy looks like. I'm listening, or in this case, reading and learning what Mr. Darcy looks like. So you see what I mean about how we've all had this experience. We all understand this experience. Nobody says whose reading is more faithful. Is my reading of Mr. Darcy a more faithful reading or yours? Because we know that reading isn't copying something faithfully or unfaithfully. Reading is engaging with something or responding to something. So it just doesn't come up to say who's right about what Mr. Darcy looks like. We wouldn't bother to think to ask that. It's true that if one of us is like an expert on men's clothing in the 1800s, that person might have, you could say, a more detailed, if not accurate, picture of what Mr. Darcy looks like. But so what? Like, that's one way of reading the book. That's not the right way. And if you're just some kid who doesn't know anything and is getting swept up in the love story, like, that's not the wrong way. So that's how reading works. And that is how I want to say translation works too. That kind of interaction with the original, that it doesn't really make sense to say is subjective or objective, is what I want to say about translation. And so let me give an example so you understand what I'm talking about. This is, I think, my favorite example of what I mean when I talk about translation being a kind of reading. So I translated Septology, the long book by Jon Fosse, and which I recommend. Great book, won the Nobel Prize. And the main thing about it, if you haven't read it or looked at it, is that the tone or voice is very calm. It sort of radiates this peacefulness, even though some of the content of what they're talking about is dark or complicated or whatever. The whole book has this kind of atmosphere of, almost sacred, if that's terminology you like to use, kind of peacefulness. So a big part of translating the book is keeping that like even surface and not letting anything stick out. So if, for example, he uses a word that the dictionary says means metaphorical, well, in Norwegian, it's going to be a simple word that means like pictory. And in English, metaphorical is 5 syllables and it's from Greek and it's sort of intellectual sounding. And so metaphorical is the wrong translation in this book because that is not the tone of the whole book and the immersion that we're in. So you'd have to translate it, oh, it's like an image of the thing, or oh, it's similar to something else. You can't use the word metaphorical because that's just not right. And so at one point in the book, this character who is not from the big city is in the big city and at like a bus station cafe and picks up a copy of this newspaper that's a local newspaper from some other place, not from the city, but from an outlying place, but it's in this kind of central place where it's at a restaurant or something, and he can pick it up. So in Norwegian, the name of this newspaper is Gula Tinde. Gula Tinde. So what that means is Gulen is a place, and Tidende is the same word as Times. So it's the Gulen Times. But what does that mean? Like, I have no idea. So I, of course, do some research on the internet. There is a place called Gulen. It's this random place in Norway. But I still don't know, like, what this means, and nor do I want to have in my translation something that is so opaque. So, because Fosse is a living author and I can ask him, I emailed him. I said, tell me, what is the deal with this Gula Tidende? So it turns out that Gula Tidende was a real newspaper that folded in the early 90s, which is why it doesn't have anything on the web. And Fosse himself biographically wrote for this paper as his first writing job, like out of college back in the day. It was taking a side in a language controversy that was important to him, and he was this journalist at this newspaper. And when I asked him, so tell me about the Gula Tidende, he told me none of that. He didn't mention it at all. I found that out years later some other way. What he told me is gula is this archaic verb, means a strong wind blowing. And the thing about the place Gulen is that it's kind of like, the Liberty Bell or something. There was this famous, if you've read any of the Icelandic sagas, the thing or ting, the sort of gathering where laws are decided among the community. There was one of those like 1,000 years ago in this place, Gulen, that retroactively gets called like the first national law of Norway. So it has this kind of iconic position in history. The Gula Law Council, like, is something that you learn in school or whatever. And then he said, but you can just call it whatever you want. Call it the Country Times or whatever you want. And he put a little parenthesis question mark after country in his email. And I didn't need him to tell me that because we had worked together before. And so I knew that I could call it something else, and he knew that I knew, and whatever. But he reinforced that this is how I'm answering you when you're asking me as a translator, what do I need to know to translate this newspaper name? So I thought, okay, strong wind, medieval law giving, like I need something that sounds like a newspaper. And the way I ended up translating it is that this character in the bus station restaurant picks up a copy of the Northern Herald. The Northern Herald. I said in my email to Fosse, what do you think about the Northern Herald? He said, that's a great translation. And I thought, thank you. I know it is. It's like perfect. It really gets it because it absolutely sounds like a newspaper. No reader is going to pick it up and be like, what's going on here? The strong wind blowing, you get this like Viking northern thing without anyone needing to know any Norwegian geography. Herald kind of subliminally gives you heraldry and heraldic and this kind of medieval vibe. So all the kind of subliminal association stuff that you want is in there. And at the same time, it doesn't stand out and make a reader go, what's a Gulen? Like, what are we talking about? And the reason I like this example is because it seems like a perfect example of something else. If you're the kind of person who wants to say that translators are subjective and arbitrary and just do whatever they want and have this like power dynamic where they have power over a helpless original text, then this seems like a perfect example for you, right? Because I know that other translators would not have come up with Northern Herald. Like, that's not what Gulatinda, quote unquote, means. And so it was an individual choice of mine that I happen to like. But, I know that if you got 10 translators in a room, like they would not come up with Northern Herald. So if you want to argue that I'm just being, you know, authoritarian and arbitrary about it, this seems like a good example for you. But for me, that's not what it feels like. For me, it felt like I couldn't read it. I couldn't read Gulatinda. I didn't know what it was doing in this book. I didn't get it. On an initial level, like I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know where Gulen was or what's going on. That part was like easy to get. But even after then, I still didn't understand what it's doing here. And so I took further steps. In my case, it was talking to the author, but it wouldn't have to be. And then I got to the point where I could read it. I understood why it was in the book. I understood what it was doing there, or how it was working in the bigger context of the whole book. And at that point, I became just as submissive, slavish, and dutiful and faithful a translator as you can be. I wasn't trying to make anything up. I wasn't trying to impose this because I have a fetish for the word herald. Like, I was trying to do what I'm always trying to do as a translator, which is how can I say in English this thing that I'm reading? And I got to this because of the process of learning how to read Gulatinda properly. That's how I would explain this example. And so it's not an example of arbitrariness and subjectivity, just like having a mental picture of Mr. Darcy isn't. It's that you're reading and you're trying to be aware of how you're responding to what you're reading. So, this is why there are no perfect translations or right or wrong translations, the same way there are no right or wrong Mr. Darcy. I'll stop mentioning Mr. Darcy, but fidelity, the question of are you faithful to what you're translating is in a way kind of a tautology, because everyone's faithful to what they're translating, but people don't translate a text, they translate their reading of a text. And everyone's going to have a different reading of the text. And so what you're faithful to is what you're reading. And you're always going to be faithful to that because you're translating. If you were just making something up, you'd call it just a book and not a translation. So even if you're doing the most freewheeling, loose adaptation version, Iliad as a space opera on the distant galaxy with octopus monsters and spaceships and whatever. Like, if you're calling it a translation of the Iliad as opposed to just some sci-fi novel, then whatever vibe or aspect or whatever that you've read from the Iliad that you're trying to put in your translation, that's what you're being faithful to. So, okay, if we can't judge translations as faithful or unfaithful, well, then what do we do with them? How do we talk about them or judge them? As a side note, with a classics connection, let me just say that I don't actually like talking about judging translations. I wish we could just talk about reading translations and not judging them. And I think there's a reason for this. Emily Wilson made this point about classics. I heard her do in a talk, the Homer translator. But I think it's true of all sorts of languages. And that is that in our culture, when we think about translation, we are more or less consciously thinking about a classroom. We're thinking about you're taking French 1 or you're taking Greek 1, and the teacher hands you something in French or Greek, and you're supposed to produce something in English to prove you've mastered the lesson of chapter 5. And that activity is called translation. So I think we have that idea in our heads of like, that's what translation is. And that means the only thing you can do with the translation is grade it. That's it. And the only way you can responsibly do that is if you have the expertise to teach a French 1 class. In other words, if you're not a French speaker who masters the French language, there's nothing you can do with the translation, because the only thing you're supposed to do is, catch the mistakes and give it a B+ or a B-. And this really does fill the culture. Like, I've talked to very smart book reviewers who love literature and translation, who say things like, oh, I couldn't possibly review that book. It's translated from Japanese and I don't speak Japanese. And it's like, well, you translate books by other people. I mean, you review books by other people all the time. I'm sorry if I said translate instead of review. The reviewer says, I can't possibly review this book that was written in Japanese because I don't speak Japanese. And I'm like, well, you review the book by the like young gay Black Alabama guy when you're none of those things. Like, that's what you do. Like, that's your job. You review books that were not written by people exactly like you. And so why can't you? When you were 3 years old and hearing stories of Poseidon, like, it didn't matter whether you knew Greek. When you were hearing about Cinderella, it didn't matter if you knew French. But like, now there's this sort of schoolroom model of expertise that gets imposed on every interaction with translation in our culture. So I think the whole question of like, how do you judge a translation kind of comes out of that. And so I don't really like it. I mean, the first question someone's asked about a novel is like, how do you judge this novel? Like, no, but with a translation, it's like, how do you grade it? Okay. So given that I don't think it's the ideal framework, what nonetheless do we say about translation if we're not going to talk about it being faithful or unfaithful? I think that the things that we want to say about a translation are whether it's respectful or disrespectful to the original, whether it's accurate or inaccurate, and whether it's readable or unreadable. And all you classicists out there might notice that this is stolen from Plato. What Socrates tells Euthyphro is that the 3 kinds of issue that cause contention and strife are arguments about the just and the unjust, the good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly. So respectful and disrespectful is analogous to just and unjust. Accurate and inaccurate is my good and bad, and readable or unreadable is my beautiful versus ugly. I think these are ways we respond to translation and things we want to say about translation. Notice one thing I'm not saying, which is foreignizing and domesticating, or foreign versus sort of hegemonically appropriative into a domestic home language. And I note that I'm not saying that because that's what kind of everyone talks about in terms of translation. If you have had any interaction with translation in any academic adjacent context, you've probably heard these terms, foreignizing and domesticating. The terms come from Lawrence Venuti, who talked about them in his book that kind of founded translation studies for the modern era. And I have some problems with that as a dichotomy for a few reasons. I think what Venuti is doing is taking a value judgment, probably of the 3 I mentioned closest to respectful and disrespectful, and labeling it as this conceptual difference. So he, instead of saying, oh, this is respectful, he calls it foreignizing. And instead of saying, this is a bit reductive and simplistic and like not really respecting the nuances of the original, he calls it domesticating. But that's kind of misleading because every translation into English domesticates it equally into English. There's no such thing as literally foreignizing because you're going into English. And in fact, Venuti says this elsewhere. My example is if you're watching a movie and there's the Nazi bad guy who says, they have ways of making you talk. That's not foreignizing. It's not German. It's English. It's a form of English that connotes Germanness in English. It's not closer to what a real German person would say because it's English words. And it's just using resources of English to imply or suggest something. If you're translating into English, you're not leaving it foreign because it's English. And so the flip side of that is when he very sharply analyzes various translations that are reductive or fail to capture things about the original, he calls them domesticating. But they're not domesticating, they're just missing stuff. And I think that it's just misleading to think in terms of domesticating. One reviewer of my philosophy of translation book said, Searls doesn't really believe anything's foreign. And kind of, yeah, that's like kind of true. And that's another thing that comes from this attention to reading. If I'm sitting down on my sofa and reading a book in German, it's not foreign because I can read it. I mean, maybe it's difficult, maybe it's more difficult than an English book, but maybe some English book is more difficult than other English books. Like there's a whole range of possibilities. Like maybe it's from this different perspective, maybe it's going to broaden my horizons, maybe it's going to narrow my horizons. All of that is true of reading in English too. It's not essential to my reading experience that it's foreign because I'm reading it, so it's not foreign. And what kind of lies behind that is this image of translation that's embedded in the word translatio, which is to ferry across, which is that translation is bringing something, right? Translation is bringing a text from some other place to my place. So there are these two islands, and nobody can go back and forth except the translator. The translator can row on over and get the text and then row it on back. And that is kind of implicit in talking about domestic versus foreign, because domestic versus foreign means that they're separated, that you have one culture, country, language, sphere, audience over here, and you have another one that's foreign. And so this spatial sense of separation is built into the discussion of domestic versus foreign. This one comes from Schleiermacher, who was an early 19th century German theologian and philosopher. And he very famously said that when you're translating, you can either leave the reader in peace as much as possible and bring the author to the reader, or you can leave the author in peace as much as possible and bring the reader to the author. So he's the one who kind of sets up this framework. His essay is called The Two Methods of Translating because there are only those two. And then, spoiler, there's actually only one. Like the bringing the author to the reader is bad and bringing the reader to the author is good. So one thing that I talk about, though, is that he is working with an example that really is pretty dramatically different. So he's talking about modern Europeans translating ancient Greek. So nobody grows up bilingual in ancient Greek and modern German. They're 2,000 years apart. Like there does seem to be pretty much a gap. Like there does seem to be a gap there, right? Um, but what I want to point out is that someone had to teach this modern German person Greek in the first place. Someone had to have published or collected editions of the Greek text that he has access to. Greek has to be one of the languages taught and valued in German culture. Some of the people reading his translation will be readers and reviewers who can read the original. And there's also a pre-existing tradition of translations from the Greek, which this translator will be responding to in one way or another. Maybe the whole German language has been shaped by this interaction with Greek. All of this pre-existing exposure is what gets left out by a model of you have the author all the way over there and you have the reader all the way over here. Then insofar as the translator and the reader share language and culture, which they have to, because otherwise they can't read the translation. The reader is going to be part of this more complicated, hybrid, multilingual community as well. So there is no isolated person over here that something is brought to. You're already existing all the time in this multilingual, complicated context. Even in the case of ancient Greek 2000 years ago and modern Europe today. And the last classical example I'll mention for today is, something that I think of as more of a paradigmatic case than than Schleiermacher's case. And that is the Septuagint, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. For some reason, I'm super insecure about pronouncing that, even though I think that's how it's pronounced. So this is the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. And the thing about that is this wasn't the case of a Greek king or philanthropist deciding that he wanted a classic work of foreign literature to be brought into Greek. What was going on was you had a Jewish community that was losing its Hebrew, and a lot of them were speaking Greek, and they decided to, as it were, push the text into Greek. Nobody was pulling or taking it or transporting it into Greek because they wanted their Library of World Literature in Greek to include this important text. No, it was this community that was shifting and wanted to make sure that all the Greek-speaking Jews were able to read their scriptures. And so they translated into Greek. So if you want to talk about domestic and foreign, like, where's the domestic community? Like, which is which? Who's, this Jewish community, is it like the foreign one or the domestic one? Well, neither. It doesn't make any sense. They're not two separate islands. It's this complicated world within which they're kind of aiming the text at a new audience. And so that to me is the more kind of emblematic thing that's going on in translation. I'm not transporting anything to some alien other place or from some alien other place. I'm in this world where I can read German and other people can't, and I'm going to make it possible for them to share my reading experience of this German text. I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say. I can, if asked, talk more about the reading like a translator aspect, or I'm happy to touch on any other aspects of anything anyone has questions for. May, what do you think? Is that good?
Sounds great. Thank you so much for that talk, Damion. So we do have time for questions, as usual. The way that you can ask a question is by using the raise hand feature, or you can, if you can't find that, or don't see it, you can also just sort of jump in, or raise your hand on the screen and I'll call on you, or you can put the question in the chat. Um, And while people are thinking of their questions, I will ask a question that I have. So yeah, one question that I'm thinking of is that we recently lost a wonderful translator, one of my favorites as well, Pierre Joris. And I was wondering if you, to what extent you're influenced by his work, and if you had any thoughts about him.
I'm not sure I heard that. When did that happen?
Um, Between the time that we were planning this and having this lecture, so within the last couple of months, yeah.
Okay, I may have heard it. I have read many of his translations and I admire him a lot. I didn't know him personally, and I wouldn't say influenced by him any more than any of the thousands of other people I've read over the years, like so I don't have a personal story about him or anything. But I loved his work. I read more of his sort of Kirchwitters type stuff than his Paul Celan type stuff. And I also loved his Poems for the Millennium anthology stuff that he did with in collaboration with others. I just liked his attitude. He did a kind of he did a translation of a fascinating, super weird Rilke text that I ended up also translating, which is this fake last will and testament that Rilke wrote from a persona, like at some point when he was pretty depressed. And then it kind of drifts into this huge list of nouns, just this list of words on a page. And like, what is this? Is it a poem? Is it a document? Is it a page of notes? And um, I love that he selected that as something to translate this weird testament. With what I'm talking about in terms of reading, it will come as no surprise that the issue of what you decide to translate or selecting what to translate is really of a piece with the translation part proper, in my view. And so I certainly think his kind of capaciousness and infinite curiosity about everything were great aspects of his work as a translator.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I just he also has his, works on theory as well. So I was sort of thinking about his book on poetics when I was reading your philosophy of translation and so on. So thank you for answering that. Um, and okay, so we have a question in the chat from Diane Rayor, who gave a talk on Friday. Diane, do you want to jump in or shall I read it to the group? All right. So the question is, I like that you said you are sharing your reading with people that can't read the language. So I guess not so much a question, but a comment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also sharing it with people who can read the language. And um, you know, the thing about translation is that the reason we're using this word sharing is because it's not proprietary in the way we usually think about texts being authored by their single author. One thing I like to think about is when it comes to movies, it's super obvious to all of us that it doesn't make sense to say, you know, is this scene or is this line by Steven Spielberg or by Leonardo or by Brad Pitt, whatever. Like, is it, who wrote it? Is it the director? Is it the actor? Is it the screenwriter who wrote the words? Is it the cinematographer, the costume designer? Like, we're not uptight about nailing down, like, who's responsible for this line? Because it's a collaborative process and we all understand that. Even, yeah, so in movies, there's not this kind of anxiety of like, wait, we have to decide like, how can I have access to what the screenwriter really meant if all I'm doing is seeing this particular actor's version of it, right? That's just not an issue. But in books, it is an issue. So there's a lot of anxiety or desire to like, no, I want the real book. I don't want the book filtered through this other person. Um, so yeah, that is in a way part of playing out what we're meaning by this word sharing.
Thanks.
Diane, did you appear because you wanted to say something on screen? No? Okay. Thanks for the
No, I
comment.
just did. That was my question.
Which
Okay,
Diane?
thanks.
Oh.
Oh,
Diane, do you have a question?
I do have a question, but I think there are other people ahead of me in line in the chat.
That's okay. We can come back to the chat if you want to ask one live.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks. I was glad to hear a kind of a takedown of domesticating versus foreignizing because I think some people have made too much of that. But if I'm getting what you're saying, you say that it's translating as you're reading, it's sharing your reading with others. And so kind of inviting them into your brain to get how you perceive this work. And one thing I've been asked about a lot is does being female affect my translation? Or and people have talked about a lot like whether, is there such a thing as a feminist translation? And of course, being a woman is part of my psyche, and so it's part of my reading. And yet I would never say, like, I think of all the things that separate me from Euripides, who I've translated a lot, I think gender is not even in the top 10. So what's your take on that? Like how
yeah.
a
I mean, like,
translator's identity affects their work?
well, I mean, the elephant in the room, the most obvious thing to say is nobody ever asks me about whether being a man affects my translation.
Right.
So, I mean, like, let's just put that very objective fact out there and, understand that it's already, there's already a very hierarchical system embedded in the person asking you that question in the first place, because otherwise they'd be asking me that question and no one ever does. So I both agree that, like, yeah, of course it affects your translation. So does it, the fact that you're in the 21st century, so does the fact that you speak English, so does your personal history and education and everything else. Like, of course, is it the most important thing? Well, depends on the kind of text and the kind of approach you're taking. Maybe not. Like, I don't think. Let me tell one story, which is that I was in grad school and I was not a like Renaissance literature person, but Stephen Greenblatt, the very eminent English professor who focuses on early modern stuff, teaching a seminar, and I was taking a seminar with him. And so he is a pioneer of what was called back in the day New Historicism. And like one of his very famous slogans is like, I begin with a desire to speak with the dead. And, so he's talking about all this stuff. And then there was one day in class when he was talking about some theoretical text that I don't remember now, written by a woman in our time. And at some point made the thing of like, oh, of course I couldn't presume to speak for that because I am not a woman and all this kind of stuff. And I actually asked him, I'm like, you presume to speak for Spencer, who is like 600 years ago, like, we all presume to speak for people all the time. Like, how come Spencer, who's super alien to us, I guess 500 years, not, or 400 even. Well, so I subtracted right when I was in grad school. Anyway, I was like, you presume to speak for that person. Like, how come someone in your language, your country, your time, your line of work, fellow academic, like, is somehow outside the bounds because of gender? Like, isn't that weird? And
Yeah.
so I asked him that in grad school, and he was like, oh, good point, and like moved on. Like, it didn't really go anywhere. But I mean, that would maybe answer how I sort of think about the question. Of course, it's part of you, and in some contexts, it'll be an important part, and in some it won't.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Diane, and Diane for those comments and questions. So we have a question from Susan Brockman. And we actually have a few different sort of questions coming up about, sort of fake translations and made up languages and things like that.
Oh, that's cool.
But before we get to that, let's talk about what Susan Brockman has to say. She says, do you think it's possible to betray an original work by translating it with an agenda? And what do you do with something which is truly untranslatable, or do you think that never happens?
Which of the two do you want me to answer first? Because they're pretty different.
I guess we'll start with the first one.
Okay. Well, I mean, my answer to all of this is that it depends. I'm well aware, just like I'm aware that part of my position is that I don't get asked if my gender affects my translations. I also am aware that I'm dealing with, literary texts from relatively prominent and quote unquote big languages in Western European countries and in a pretty aesthetic realm. And that's a very different kind of translation that raises different issues than if I was doing the first ever translation from some obscure language that's about to go extinct, or if I was doing a religious text that has taboos around it, or if there were other sort of, political power dynamics going on. Rilke doesn't need me to look out for him, nor, in fact, does the German language need me to look out for it. So that issue just kind of doesn't come up in the kind of work that I personally do, which doesn't mean that I think it never happens. I mean, one thing, I talk about this in the book too, and this was a challenge in writing the book, because on the one hand, I didn't want to sort of check boxes and bring up a lot of things that other people were saying. I wanted to just lay out my position. But on the other hand, I didn't want to be pretending that my experience is the only experience that a translator can have, or is more valid or representational than anybody else's. So I did feel a need to sort of secondhand present other people's positions on some of these questions you might call political questions, even though it sounds a bit different because it wasn't coming from me. So, for example, Don Nietzsche, who's this very prominent Korean to English translator, talks a lot about how you can't, or she can't, separate Korean to English translation from the fact that the US colonized Korea, and that's how, that's built into the kinds of text she's translating, and where she sees herself and where she sees her audience and all this kind of stuff. So that's a sort of slightly digression answer to your question about an agenda. I just think, sure, sometimes there's texts that have an agenda, and sometimes there are translators that have an agenda, and sometimes they don't match. And so, sure, it sometimes happens. I don't think that, I don't think it would really make sense to talk about like my agenda for Fosse and whether that matches or is inappropriate or not or something. Because it's just not that kind of situation. So I don't know if that's a satisfying or unsatisfying answer, but it just depends, you know. And I think an interesting way to think about it, as with the case of, you know, does gender matter? Well, you only mean that about one gender, is to think in terms of the different examples and how they're treated differently. So one thing I like to think about is that certainly back in the day, whenever I was reading a novel in English translated from Arabic, there'd be a glossary in the back that says, oh, this is a kind of tense, or this is whatever, or this is a kind of prayer, blah, blah, blah. And how do we think of that? Do we think of that as positive and informational and interesting and like sharing stuff? Or do we think of it as kind of dismissive and turning the book into anthropology instead of literature? Well, Elena Ferrante books don't have a glossary in the back. Gabriel Garcia Marquez books don't have a glossary in the back. They are presented as the kinds of things that monolingual English people can just read and just appreciate as art, and without being told that this is the name of a kind of banana leaf in Colombia or wherever. And so how do we then think about it? Are the footnotes in the back of the Arabic novel good or bad? Like if I'm translating a novel from Arabic, do I want footnotes there or not? If I'm working in a publisher's office, do I think we need to add them or not? There's not a like simple yes or no answer to it, but like those are the political questions and the questions about agenda as they really play out, you know? Maybe I'll just stop there. I don't know if I can say anything else useful about that. In terms of the untranslatability question, I feel pretty strongly, no, nothing is untranslatable, because then how can you read it? What I often do when someone brings up the untranslatability question is like, okay, tell me your definition of successful translatability. Tell me the thing that you're saying this text doesn't have, so that we know what we're talking about. And people usually can't, or if they do, it's like, oh, I'm saying that, you know, in reading an English translation of a Mandelstam poem, you don't get perfect, crystalline, pure access to the author's intentions or something. And I'm like, guess what? None of the Russian readers do either. Nor does the author even have perfect access to the meaning of his own text. Like, so it's not a translation problem, it's a you problem. You've like come up with this definition that nothing satisfies. So it's not that it's stop calling it untranslatability, say that there's no such thing as a perfect communion of minds. And then you can have that conversation if that's the conversation you want to have. Another version of this is to say, well, okay, if you're saying this Russian poem is untranslatable, then what are you saying the Russian audience, the Russian readers can get from it that there's no way any English reader can get from a translation, no matter how good? And that forces the discussion into a more concrete level of, you know, what are we actually talking about? Yeah, the English reader can't get anything about the Russian language because they don't know the Russian language and because the translated poem is in English. But we knew that. That's what translation is. So it's not a problem unless you're going to make other arguments about why that's a problem. the the last thing I'll say is that there's this issue of the words, like the one word that by itself is untranslatable because it has this meaning that's super embedded in the culture or something. And I tell this story in the book, but I think it's a good story. So I was giving a panel talk with this playwright that I had translated his play, and he was talking about untranslatable words, and he was telling one of these stories. I'm sure you know the stories. I'm sure you've seen the lists online of like this Patagonian word, and what it means is like there's a man and a woman in a bar, and they look at each other, and their looks both say like, okay, I'm interested, but you have to make the first move. I'm not going to make the first move. And that's what this word means. And everyone laughed. Thank you for laughing, whoever you are in invisible Zoom space. And so what I said is, you just translated it. Like, there it is. You just translated it, and everyone laughed. And now we know what it means. And he started to say, like, oh, but you can't do it in one word. And I said, well, what matters more to you, how many words it is, or whether everybody laughs? So the issue of untranslatability is like, yeah, there are mechanical aspects. Like there's a compound word in German that isn't a compound word in English. So what? Like that is not sure, maybe there's some artistic project where the word count matters, and so that becomes an issue. But in general, if you're trying to translate this look in a bar, you can explain it. You can put a footnote. The footnote isn't like outside the translation because the translation failed. It's in the translation. You're just translating it as a footnote instead of as running text. If there was something that no English speaker could ever possibly grasp, then how can you grasp it as a bilingual person? You're an English speaker. Or say you learned the other language first. Well, you weren't born knowing Russian, like you learned Russian. So it's maybe there's something that's so complicated that you have to learn Russian to understand it, but still you can, So I just think that if translation is your perspective on something, there's no such thing as a chair that looks the same from every perspective. That's not what seeing is. And so there's no such thing as a word or a text that's the same from that is always read the same way, because that's just not what reading is. And so if how you're reading it is what you're translating, then of course you can always translate it because you're always reading it in whatever way you're reading it. That's the kind of framework that I have for thinking about the untranslatability question. Now, does that mean that everything is equally easy and the translator can do whatever they want and you never have to worry about conveying some nuance that English readers will misunderstand? No, of course not. You have to try, and you have to, do a good job, and you have to be as rich in your reading and understand or grasp in some way as much of the original as you can in order to be making your decisions about what to convey and how to convey it. So it's not like automatic no problem, but it just misunderstands what reading is to say that there's something untranslatable. That's what I would say. And I just see your follow-up complicated. Right. Well, so your translation might have to be complicated. You might have to try it.
No. Complicated is a specific reference to Emily Wilson's choice to translate the untranslatable in one word in Greek, polytropos, as complicated in English. And it's a direct challenge to her decision to do that, which has upset many classicists and people who've been reading the Odyssey in Greek and teaching it for decades.
I love that translation. I talk about it in my book as a great example. And because, not that means I think it should be uncontroversial. One reason it's such a great choice is that it gets people thinking about how they read the original, thinking about what their own agenda or priorities or positions are, And I think that given various of her goals of like making it poetic but approachable, making it iambic pentameter, making it not nail down the which of the different multiple aspects of the word is takes priority. Like I personally love it as a translation. I don't know if that is an unpopular opinion in this room, but again, you know, it would make sense why I would like it because she's translating into English, and having line one say that it's complicated makes for an extremely rich engagement with the text. So yeah.
Thank you. Do you have a minute for one more question?
Yes, I do. Sorry, I ran over.
No, that's okay. Thank you for spending your time with us. So the final question, like I mentioned, is not so much a question, but some themes that are showing up in the chat from two different people. Kieran is talking about The Lord of the Rings and the conceit of translating a historical account from ancient human Elvish texts and the translation process there. And then I think, is it Susan Brockman is mentioning, yes, Cervantes and the translation of the Moorish manuscript. And I guess the question is something along the lines of the role of translation as an imaginary practice and how that plays into it as a practical practice.
Yeah, what a fascinating question. I mean, I think this gets back to this issue of authority, right? If you're claiming that you're translating this from the elves, then you're in a way claiming that within the fictional universe, you're not the author. Obviously, we all know that there wasn't an Elvish manuscript and Tolkien is the author, but you are sort of presenting it as not exactly coming from you in the same way as other books. And I think that that is very generative for a lot of people's creativity, to like not feel like it's coming from them. Just to speak personally, you know, I'm a creative writer as well as a translator, if, you know, in the normal sense of those categories, not getting complicated. And I've always kind of thought that there were two kinds of writers. They're the ones who feel like they have something inside themselves that they want to express. They want to, you know, put their voice into the world. And it's this kind of inward to outward motion. And then there are people with what I think of as a translator's imagination that think of writing in terms of you take something in and then you share it or put it back out. So obviously a translator's doing that. They're taking in an original text and then putting it back out. But I think even if it just comes to like you're writing your own novel in your own language, we're not talking about translation in the literal sense. I think there are people who, including me, who feel that way about creativity, that what I'm doing is, you know, being a person in the world and taking all this stuff in, and what I do with that, how I think about it, how it interacts within me and stuff, is what I'm trying to put on the page, as opposed to something like sourced from within myself. And so I think the like fake translation move that you mentioned in these two novels is related to that. It's in a way literalizing this metaphor of, you know, yes, I'm writing this book, but it's not coming from me. I am not trying to say that I am the source of it in some sort of existential way. So that's how I would kind of locate that fictional move.
Thank you. Yeah, it strikes me that in these like fictional translations, you do kind of get like a foreign there might be some sort of like foreignizing thing where like, you know, the elvish text is very exotic and like ancient, and they sort of like play up these sorts of ideas as a way of making the fiction stronger. So,
Right. Well, or the Moorish, you know.
yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, of course. So what are we comparing? We're comparing the case of Tolkien's just writing this book describing magical elfland, or he's pretending to be translating a book that was like written in magical elfland. Like literally, we the readers know that it's the same, like that Tolkien's making it up. But by giving this, you know, by embedding this relation in the text, it's not only foreignizing to us, but it's authentic from within, right? Like, so, well, if the elves are saying it about themselves, it must be true, as opposed to me just making stuff up about the elves. Like, there's a great short story by Alfred Doblin, who wrote Berlin Alexanderplatz, that's about, it's called Traffic with the Beyond, and it takes place in like interwar England, and this spiritualist society is super happy that they found this medium who like brings in the audience and brings in the bucks. And, you know, he does a really good job. And then there's this murder in the town, and nobody can solve it. And someone comes up with the idea, well, why don't we just ask the dead guy? Why don't we just go to the spiritualist society and have him ask the spirit of the murder victim, like what happened? And so this kicks off this whole story, where we're getting all this information about like what life's really like from the other side. And so it's very analogous to what we're talking about here. And, you know, they wear pajamas all the time, and they're kind of stupid, and they get stupider over the millennia that since they've been dead. And, you know, there are these dance parties, and like there's all this stuff that's kind of crazy, but it's presented as like, no, it's for real. It's not just me making up wacky things, because it's what the dead people are saying. Anyway, that's in a book called Bright Magic, which I translated, and it's an incredible story. So recommend that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a pleasure to hear you talk about the elves and Lord of the Rings. All right, so I think we're about out of time. So thank you again, Damion, for this wonderful talk. Thanks to
Oh,
everyone.
thank you, everybody. Thanks for spending your Sunday and for all the great questions.